Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Our lab is about the eye and the orbital cavity. So the orbit cavity actually formed by 7 bones. And this orbit cavities is pyramid in shape. The middle wall formed by the lacrimal, also formed by ethmoidal bone, and also it's a part of the sphenoid bone inside. This is the middle bone. The lateral wall formed by zygomatic and also formed by greater wing, the greater wing of the sphenoid bone, and the superior wall formed by the frontal and a part of the sphenoid, the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone. The floor of the pyramid is formed by maxilla and also formed by a part of the sphenoid bone, and the very anterior bone, it's a palatine, which is coming from the palatine bone that forms the roof of our mouth here in this part. So this is the orbit cavity of our eye. Inside the orbit cavity, there is some openings which allow some structures to coming from the cranial fossa, pass through these fissures. So we have actually 2 fissures. The superior, that part we call it superior fissure, and that's one we call it the inferior fissure. Around in that area there is also a tendon. We call it a circle tendon. The circle tendon, which can hold the extrinsic muscle of the eye. So the structures actually, some of them passing in the superior fissure, some of them also passing through that tendinous, the ring, tendinous ring, some of them passing out of the tendinous ring. So the structures actually passing out of the tendinous ring. Some branches of the ophthalmic nerve, like lacrimal branch, frontal ophthalmic nerve, and also the trochlear nerve. And also there is another vein, we call it the superior ophthalmic vein, also pass through the superior fissure, and also it's out of the tendinous ring. Some structures actually pass in the superior fissure, and inside, between the tendinous ring, we call it the superior branch of the oculomotor, and also the nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic and the abducens nerve, and also the inferior branch of the oculomotor. So we have superior and the inferior branch of the oculomotor, they both pass in the superior fissure and also pass through the tendinous ring. In the inferior fissure, there is only one structure, which is the inferior ophthalmic vein, pass through this area. And also we have in this part here, this is the optic canal, which allow the optic nerve to pass from the cranial fossa and coming to connect the eyeball, pass through the optic canal. So the optic nerve pass with the ophthalmic artery, they all passing through the optic canal, and they also pass through the tendinous ring. So we have to differentiate which structure pass through the tendinous ring, which structure pass out of the tendinous ring, and also we have to differentiate which structures passing from the superior and the inferior and the optic canal. It's very important to differentiate between them. This is another model to show the inferior fissure and the superior fissure. As we explained, the superior fissure, the structure passed through it is some branches of the ophthalmic, like the lacrimal, frontal, and also the trochlear nerve, plus the superior ophthalmic vein. So they all pass out of the tendinous ring. We're still in the superior fissure. Superior fissure also can pass some other structures from it, like the inferior and the superior oculomotor nerve, and also the abducent nerve, and the nasociliary branch of the ophthalmic nerve. They all passing in the superior fissure, but that structures passing through the tendinous ring. So the inferior fissure, we have only one structure, which is the inferior ophthalmic vein. And also, as you see here, this is like the optic nerve, which pass through the optic canal. The optic nerve and the ophthalmic artery passing from the optic canal, and they all pass also through the tendinous ring. There is another structure here, in the lacrimal canal. So this is to let the lacrimal duct and the lacrimal sac to pass through this area, this canal. Before we talk about the eye itself, we want to mention about some structures form the eyelids. As we can see here, we have the superior and the inferior tarsus. Those, the framework to hold or to shape, to give the shape of the eyelid, the superior tarsus and the inferior. Over the tarsus, we have muscle, we call it orbicularis oculi. The orbicularis oculi has two parts. First part, we call it palpebral part. Palpebral because it's over directly the eyelid, and around the edges of the orbital cavity, we have the other part, we call it the orbital part. So the function actually of the palpebral to pumping the tear on the corner, and the function of the orbital part for the force squeeze or for winking, for example. And they all around the eye, outside of the eye. So now we will talk about the eye. The eye actually formed by three layers. The fibrous layer, which is form the outer layer of the eye, and inside there is another layer, vascular layer, and the innermost we call it the eyeball, the innermost we call it the retina. So the outside, the fibrous layer of the eye formed by two parts. This anterior part called the cornea, and this posterior part of the eye we call it the sclera. All of that sclera. And this, the anterior part, we call it the cornea. If we open this model, we can see here the middle layer, the vascular layer of the eye, and we call it the choroid. The posterior part is the choroid, and anterior of the choroid, we can, if we open it a little bit like that, we can see here The other structure we call it the ciliary body. The ciliary body, actually, it has also the projection, and that projection, actually, we can see it here. This part, this is the ciliary body. In here, there is a projection to hold or to attach with the ligament. That ligament also attach to the lens, to this part. So during the contraction, the muscle contraction in the ciliary body, this can change the focus of our lens. So again, this is the choroid posterior, and in the anterior we have a ciliary body which has the muscle, ciliary muscle, and we can't see the ligament actually here. There is some ligament extend from the ciliary projection up to the lens to attach the lens to change the focusing of our lens. And anterior, actually, this part here, this part, we call it the iris. So the iris is a part of the ciliary body. It's the colored part of our eye. So if you look to your eye, the colored part is the iris. And actually the iris, there is two types different of muscles. The first outer one is the dilator muscle, and the inner one, we call it the constructed muscle of the iris. This part of our eye, we call it the optic disc. This is the area where the optic nerve connects to our eye, and there is artery and vein also passing through the optic nerve. We call them the central retinal artery and vein, coming with the optic nerve to supply of our eye. So the eye, we have here two parts of the cavities. We have a posterior cavity. We have a posterior cavity and the anterior cavity. We can see them here. The posterior cavity, and the anterior cavity. Anterior cavity also divided into two cavities, the most anterior and the posterior. So the most anterior, actually, it's in between the cornea and our iris. Posterior to the iris, we call it the posterior of the anterior cavity. And here, in the posterior part, the very large room, this part, it's the posterior cavity, which filled with the fibrous body. This part, if we take this out, we can see the posterior cavity is the larger actually than the anterior one, which filled by this one, we call it the fibrous body. This is actually a structures it's formed actually the lens of our eye, which is located here behind the iris. This is the colored one. We call it the iris, as you see here. This is the iris, and this is the ciliary. This is the ciliary body, which connect to the iris. And as you see here, we should have some ligament from the projection of our iris body to give ability to change the focus of our lens. So we can see here also, this is the ciliary, this part is the ciliary body, and this scallop shaped form the ora serrata, which is the junction between the retina and the ciliary body. This is the optic disc. Next to the optic disc, we have another round shape in the posterior wall of our eye, and we call it macula lottia. The macula lottia, the central of the macula lottia, we call it fovea centralis. This part of our eye is responsible for the sharp vision. The eye has three layers. Outer layer is the fibrous, this part, and the inner layer, the vascular, and the innermost layer is the retina, the nerves layer. So we will talk first about this layer, the fibrous layer, which contain three important structures. First, the anterior one is the cornea, and the posterior part is the sclera. Between the cornea and the sclera, there is the junction, and we call it the lumbus. And the lumbus contain the sinus, the scleral sinus, to drain the aqueous humor liquid, which formed by the ciliary body. So this is the outer layer, the sclera, which form around 1/5 of the structure of the posterior wall of the eye, and 1/6 of the structure of the anterior part of the eye is the cornea. The cornea, it's transparent and it's colorless, and there is no vascular in the cornea. So the second layer, which is the vascular layer, this is the posterior wall, is the choroid. This is the choroid, and the anterior part is the ciliary. This is the ciliary body. This one, this structure around the eye is the ciliary body. And this part is the iris. This one is the iris, and the iris has two muscles, the dilator muscle, and this is the ciliary, the iris. So the iris has two muscles, the dilator and the constrictor muscle. The constrictor muscle, the dilator, and this is the ciliary. We can't see here in this model, we can't find the retina, which is the innermost layer, but we can see the scallop shape of the ciliary. This is the junction between the ciliary body and the retina. And we call this structure, the scallop shape, we call it ora serrata. There is also here this is the ciliary body. The ciliary body also contains the ciliary muscle, and we can see the lens. It is stay in this part. So the lens can connect to the ciliary body by the ligament, suspensory ligament, between the lens and the ciliary body. So if you focus on the specific structure in the vision field, the ciliary body or the ciliary muscle will contract, and that will adjust the focus of the lens and will make it clear. There is another structure inside the eye. This is the optic disc. It's also called the blind spot. And next to the optic disc, there is macula lutea for high resolution of the picture. So during the damaging or degeneration of the macula lutea, that will cause a spot. That we can see a spot in the vision field. We can see this is the optic nerve. The optic nerve, also this is the central retinal artery which supply the whole retina. Inside the innermost layer, which is the retina, we have around 10 layers of the retina. First one is the pigmented layer, which surround the whole eye, from the posterior up to the anterior, the ciliary, plus the iris. Second layer is the cone and rods. The cones and the rods, they are the receptor to collect the light. So this is the second layer, but the second layer, it's only surround the posterior wall of the most posterior wall of the eye, up to this side. So we call this the reactive part of the eye, and this is non-reactive. The third layer is the nerves, which contain the bipolar cell. So it's a nerve layer of the retina, which also surround the whole eye structure, from posterior and the ciliary and also the iris. After we explained the eyeball, we need to know the muscle, the extraocular muscle of the eye. So we have four rectus and 2 oblique. The rectus, we have this one is the superior, and this one is the lateral, and inside here is the middle rectus. And if we remove that part, the eye, this part is the inferior rectus. The oblique, we have 2 obliques. The superior oblique and the inferior oblique. Okay. The superior oblique has this tendon. This is the tendon of the superior oblique, and the superior oblique innervate by the trochlear. The middle and the inferior and the superior rectus innervate by oculomotor, and the lateral rectus innervate by abducent. And all the abducent, the trochlear, oculomotor, they have to work together in the same time to control the movement of the eyeball. This part show that the lacrimal duct and the nasolacrimal duct and the lacrimal sac. This is the most superior, the sac, and then the duct coming inside the lacrimal canal to collect all the tears which excrete from the lacrimal gland. This model show the lacrimal gland. This is the lacrimal gland, which locate in the lateral superior orbital cavity, and it's divided. This muscle is the palpebral superiosis, which divide the lacrimal gland into two parts, the orbital and the palpebral part by the tendon. And also here we have this structure, the lacrimal sac and the nasolacrimal duct of the eye. This is another structure, plastinate eye. It shows also the muscle, the extraocular muscle of the eye. So to know or to specify the muscles, you need to put the eye in the anatomical position. So this eye, actually this part is the middle part, and this is the lateral part of the eye. So if we can see here, this part is the ligament, the tendon of the superior oblique, and that's why we can call this part this is the superior oblique, because of the tendon as that structure plastic. So this is the tendon and that is the tendon. Then we have here two muscles actually. First, this part actually is the part of the palpebral superiosis, okay, but inside we can see the superior rectus just beneath the palpebral superiosis, just beneath. And this muscle actually is the lateral rectus, and this part of the muscle is the inferior oblique, and that part is the inferior rectus of the muscle, and that's all the extraocular muscle. This model will explain more about the nerves that coming through the superior fissure, superior orbital fissure. So as we can see here, this is the ophthalmic, this is the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve, ophthalmic and maxillary and mandibular. So we can see this is the ophthalmic, and we have explained that also in our lecture. There is a branch coming from the ophthalmic, some of them coming out of the tendinous ring, this part, some of them coming, one of them actually coming inside the tendinous ring. So if we follow the ophthalmic nerve, we can see this is the first branch. We call it the frontal branch of the ophthalmic. The other branch which also coming out of the tendinous ring, this one, which innervate the lacrimal gland, and we call it the lacrimal branch of the ophthalmic. And also we can see here the oculomotor. The oculomotor, we have two ramus. We have inferior and the superior. So this part is the superior, and that's one is the inferior ramus of the oculomotor. And they all both coming inside the tendinous ring. Also, we have this one is the abducent, which supply the lateral rectus, this one, This one is the abducent. This is part of the rectus. So the abducent coming down, and we have here, this is the very small ganglia. We call it the ciliary ganglia, which the most anastomosis of that fibers occurring, the parasympathetic and sympathetic occurring in the ciliary ganglia.